Welcome to another Access Extension Framework tutorial. This is the Shadow Tables tutorial, where we'll be investigating why we actually need shadow tables. For this we're going to use the single file Northwind database just to keep it really simple. And we'll be looking at characteristics of the built-in Access native user interface that causes us problems that we need to solve. So first of all we're going to have a small interlude and talk about my golden rules of application and database development. So 1 and 2 sort of go together. The user interface should never dictate characteristics of the data model, and the data model should never dictate characteristics of the user interface. So what this is really saying is that these are two completely different systems, and they often have different optimal ways of doing things. So the data model needs to be concise, and it needs to be validated well so that the data quality is good. And at the other pole there's the user interface, which needs to be ideally quite flexible. And it needs sometimes to be able to be viewed in different ways by the user, ways that are not necessarily easily supported by the data model. So my principle is that these should be developed separately, and that the concerns are quite separate, and if there's leakage from one into the other, then that causes trouble for one or both sides. Number 3 might be a bit controversial, but I always enforce non-nullability in database columns unless there is an absolute need for a null. Now the reason for this is that basically null values cause problems. You can see in VBA and in .NET as well. Let's do a quick experiment. You've probably seen this error before, quite a lot really if you use Access. So VBA and the back-end languages often don't deal with nulls very well. Now as long as we have an outer join operator, we're never going to do away with nulls completely. There's always going to be nulls on the outer side of an outer join where there is no record matching. So we can't do away with nulls. What we want to do is manage them. And one of the easy ways of managing nulls is to not allow database columns to be null. That is, we enforce them to be a value and we give them a default. So for example, a string type would default to an empty string. A numeric type may default to 0. A good example of something that actually has to be 0 is, say, a start and finish date. Now we may be able to enforce that the start date is non-null. But often when we start a process we don't know what the finish date's going to be, so that's a good example of a column that does need to be null. But what this principle states is that if there's no need, then we should make the column non-nullable and we should give it a sensible default value. Okay, so we're back from the interlude. Let's have a quick look at some of the problems with the existing Access interface. So I've got a scenario here, say a customer's rung up and I'm on the phone and they're starting to reel off a list of products they want on their order. So we'll go into the orders screen, go down to the bottom and create a new record. Now I'd like to just start entering products here. We've got 34 of these and so on. So it's putting a nice little message here saying please select a customer to bill before entering details, and it's erased that line. What I'd really like to be able to do is just put these products in without having to worry about this at this point. But if we select this, then we can go on and we can enter this information. Now that was quite a nice little message and it did things very nicely, but let's go and have a look at what's happening under the hood here. So we've got a on-error event, so it's monitoring the on-error event for the form. If it's finding an error, then it's printing that little message we saw, and it's running an undo command to undo all of this, all of the records that we just put in. So what I'd like to do is just disable this for now, this entire function here, and we'll go back and run that again. Order, new, and then we'll go and try this. This time we're seeing the real error, and that's a little bit less user-friendly than before, but the real problem comes here when we say, okay, I don't really know what that means, but maybe I'll try going up here to order this, and we're going to keep getting that error no matter where we try to go to. Now the user at this point has to know that they need to hit the escape key to undo that record, otherwise they're not going to be able to go anywhere. So what that forces us to do is put that little bit of error code in, which is fine if we remember to do it, but a lot of the time we don't. And earlier versions of this Northwind database didn't have that code, and in fact some of the versions crashed Access when we tried to do this. So you can see that this is one of the problems which it would be nice to be able to solve. It'd be nice if we could go in and enter any data we like anywhere without needing first to enter certain other items of data. And I think this is a good example of the data model leaking into the user interface, because in the data model, this obviously is a parent record. The single form is a parent record to the continuous form. So the problem is that we need to have this order ID here first, which indicates that the parent record's been created before we can go and create the child records. Okay, so that's one issue. Let's have a look at another one. We'll close this. And I want to go into the orders form. And you'll notice, in typical Access fashion, required, no. Let's have a look at this required field down here. Employee ID, required, no. Order date, required, no. Pretty much nothing is required. In fact, we can get away, probably, if we go into this, let's close the property sheet. If we go directly into the back end, create our new record, we may actually be able to enter this with no information at all. Oh, we need something just to create the new record. There you go. Look at the magnificent data quality of this new record. So the whole point really of required fields in databases is to protect data quality. So that's not a particularly good thing that we've just been able to enter that without any information at all. So let's try opening the table in design mode and requiring a few more things. So employee ID, that's actually the customer number. Let's say that that's required. Maybe let's require an order date as well, and we'll save that. Now there are some blanks in there which violates the rules, but that doesn't really matter for the purposes of what we're doing here. So let's try this again. Let's go create a new order. And I'm going to just type a space in the salesperson date. Now the fact that I've entered something is enough to trigger the creation of an order. And we're back to that same situation now where I can't get out of this field. I can select something, but say if I go back and remove the space, I just want to leave this field empty, I still can't get out of it without selecting something. And unless I know about the escape key, I'm being forced into doing something I may not want to do. Now the same thing applies to the order date here. Unless I know about escape, I'm stuck in this field. So this is an example of the concerns of the data being required, coming straight through to the user interface and having an impact on that. And so you can see that's exactly the reason why everybody turns all of the required fields off, as we saw in the orders table, and hence the data quality in the orders table, if it's not entered correctly, can be abysmal. And it's one of the main reasons why developers in the development world don't really take Access seriously as a platform. It's because nearly every time you look in an Access database, there are empty records all over the place. It's quite easy to accidentally create them, and then because there's no data there, they don't reference any parent or child records, you get orphan records, and the data quality really is just very poor. So there's several approaches that people have taken to try to get around this problem. One of them is unbound forms. So quite a lot of the time nowadays, it's almost in vogue as an Access thing. I'm just going into design view here. So rather than binding to an underlying data source, so we leave the control unbound, and then we can write some code. I've done this myself, so the tag, for me, I think it was something like FP01 customer, and that tag would tell the binding code that this was data bound control and it was group 1, so we could actually bind to multiple tables if we wanted, and the name of the field. And then you can write some generic code that will have a look at the schema of the database and do things like validation to make sure that if that is a required field that the data value is in there. And it's become quite popular. It's not a bad approach, but the main problem with that approach is that we have these continuous child forms. Now you can't unfortunately do unbound forms in a continuous manner. So what you usually end up with is a bit of a hodgepodge. So you've got the parent form is unbound, and then you've got to either have logic that hides or shows this form only when it's been created, or sometimes people just ignore the fact. And obviously one of the other problems is even if the parent form has got data in it, say it's been retrieved from the database, there's usually a save button to save the data in the parent record that's unbound. And we might go ahead and enter this child data, and then we edit this, and then we decide to cancel out and not save this data, but even though the parent data wasn't saved, the child data was, so there's an inconsistent state there between the two forms. So unbound forms are an okay solution, but they're not really probably what we want. And also the code to do the binding ends up being quite complex. So if you'd like to move on to part 2, that covers what the shadow tables are and how they solve these problems.